It started with a sound no one could quite explain. A sharp crack beneath the soil, followed by the terrified scream of a horse. In the fading light of an autumn evening in 1837, a farm laborer named Thomas Hale was guiding his plow across a quiet stretch of land near the Virginia-North Carolina border. It was supposed to be just another long, exhausting day. The kind that ended with sore hands and little to show for it. But then the ground gave way. His horse stumbled violently, nearly collapsing as one of its legs sank deep into the earth. Thomas rushed forward, heart pounding, trying to calm the animal. At first, he thought it had stepped into a hidden burrow or a patch of soft mud. But when he knelt down and pushed away the loose dirt, his fingers struck wood. Old wood. Buried wood. That was the moment everything changed. What he uncovered wasn't just debris or a forgotten box. It was a small, carefully constructed crate, hidden just beneath the surface as if someone had gone through great effort to make sure it stayed unseen. And when the lid finally broke open, Thomas froze. Inside were bones. Human bones. Yellowed with time, fragile, and arranged in a way that made it impossible to mistake what he was looking at. A skull stared back at him, its surface cracked, its jaw slightly open as if caught mid-scream. For a moment, the world went silent. No wind. No birds. No distant sounds of farm life. Just the quiet, suffocating realization that he was standing on something far darker than farmland. He stumbled back, his breath shaking, his hands trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural. Someone had buried this. And suddenly, the land didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. By sunrise the next morning, word had spread. At first, it was just whispers among nearby farms. Then came the riders. Then came the authorities. Men arrived with tools, questions, and a growing sense of unease. What they expected to find was a single, unfortunate incident. What they actually found would haunt the region for decades. They started digging. Carefully at first, then with urgency. And then they found another. And another. Each discovery more disturbing than the last. Different burial spots. Different remains. Some larger, some heartbreakingly small. This wasn't one body. It was a pattern. A system. A secret that had been buried, literally, for years. And at the center of that secret was a name people had only ever spoken in low voices. Eleanor Harrow. If you had passed through Briar Crossroads a few years earlier, you never would have noticed anything unusual. It wasn't the kind of place that drew attention. A scattering of homes. A few farms. A dusty road cutting through thick woods and low marshland. Travelers passed through without stopping, and those who lived there kept mostly to themselves. Isolation was normal here. Silence was expected. And questions, well, questions weren't always welcome. But there was one place people did stop. A roadside inn known as Harrow's Rest. It stood just off the main trail, its wooden structure worn but sturdy, lanterns glowing faintly in the evenings. To a tired traveler, it looked like a blessing. A warm meal. A place to sleep. A break from the endless road. And for many, it was exactly that. But for some, it was the last place they were ever seen. Eleanor Harrow didn't look like the kind of person people feared. That was part of what made her so dangerous. She was tall for a woman of her time, with a strong build that hinted at years of hard labor. Her presence was commanding, but not in an obvious way. It was subtle. Controlled. Her voice, according to those who knew her, carried a strange weight to it. Calm, but firm. The kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to make people listen. Neighbors described her as private. Reserved. Not unfriendly, but not warm either. She kept her distance. And people, instinctively, kept theirs. What no one could prove, at least not yet, was that behind the walls of her home and the floors of her inn, something unthinkable had been taking place. For years, people had gone missing. Not in large numbers. Not in ways that caused panic. Just enough to be noticed, but not enough to spark real action. A farmhand who never returned from a trip. A young woman who left for work and was never seen again. A traveler who passed through and simply vanished. At the time, it was easy to explain away. People moved. People disappeared. Life was uncertain, especially in places like Briar Crossroads. But now, standing over freshly uncovered graves, those explanations began to fall apart. As investigators continued digging, a pattern started to emerge. The bodies hadn't been buried randomly. They were placed deliberately. Carefully. Almost methodically. Some were hidden in crates. Others wrapped in cloth. A few showed clear signs of injury, fractures, blunt force trauma, marks that told a story even without words. And the most disturbing detail? Some graves were shallow. Too shallow. As if whoever buried them hadn't expected anyone to look too closely. Or perhaps didn't care anymore. By the third day of excavation, the atmosphere had changed completely. What began as a local curiosity had turned into something far more serious. Men who had spent their lives working the land now refused to step onto certain parts of it. Even the officials, men used to dealing with crime and hardship, spoke in quieter tones. Because deep down, they all understood the same thing. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was evidence of something much larger. Something organized. Something that had been allowed to exist, unnoticed. And then came the question no one wanted to ask out loud. How many? How many people had passed through this place and never left? How many families were still waiting for answers they would never receive? How long had this been happening? And most importantly, who else was involved? Because one thing was already becoming clear. Eleanor Harrow could not have done this alone. That realization sent a chill through everyone involved. Because if this was a network, then it didn't end here. And if it didn't end here, then somewhere out there, others were still hiding in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. As the sun set on the fourth day, one of the investigators stood quietly near the edge of the property, staring out at the darkening woods. He later described a feeling he couldn't shake. A sense that the ground beneath his feet was holding more secrets than they were ready to uncover. And maybe more than they ever would. Because some stories don't begin with answers. They begin with a single, terrifying discovery. And a question that refuses to go away. What really happened here? The digging didn't stop. Even after the sun disappeared and darkness swallowed the fields, no one wanted to leave. Lanterns were lit. Shadows stretched across the ground as men continued working through the night, driven by something stronger than duty. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was fear. Because with every inch of soil removed, the truth became harder to ignore. This place had been used. Not once. Not twice. But over and over again. By the fifth day, the number of graves had grown beyond anything they had expected. And that's when the rumors started to feel real. People in nearby towns had whispered for years about strange things happening near Briar Crossroads. Wagons traveling at odd hours. Lights in the woods long after midnight. Voices, where no one should have been. Most had dismissed it as superstition. Now, standing in the middle of freshly uncovered graves, those same stories felt less like imagination. And more like warnings no one had listened to. Investigators began focusing on one location more than any other. Harrow's Rest. The inn had always been the center of quiet suspicion, even before the bodies were found. Travelers came. Travelers left. But sometimes they didn't. When officials first entered the building, nothing seemed out of place. The main room was exactly what you'd expect. Wooden tables. A stone fireplace. The faint smell of old smoke soaked into the walls. Everything looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. But there was something about the air inside. Something heavy. Like the building itself was holding its breath. They searched every room. Every corner. Every inch. And at first, they found nothing. No obvious signs of violence. No evidence that connected the inn directly to what was happening outside. But then one of the men noticed something strange. The floor. It didn't sound right. When he stepped on a certain section near the back of the building, the wood gave off a hollow echo. Different from the rest. Subtle, but unmistakable. He called the others over. And within minutes, tools were brought in. The boards were pried loose. One by one. Until finally, they saw it. A space beneath the floor. Hidden. Deliberate. And large enough to hold more than just supplies. The smell hit them first. Damp. Stale. Suffocating. The kind of air that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Lanterns were lowered into the darkness, revealing a narrow chamber below. Chains. Rusted, but still intact. Iron rings fixed into the wooden beams. And marks along the walls, scratches. Dozens of them. Maybe more. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Because everyone in that room understood exactly what they were looking at. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a prison. As they expanded the search, more hidden spaces were discovered. Behind walls. Beneath storage rooms. Even a narrow passage leading away from the building toward the woods. Every new discovery painted a clearer picture. This wasn't random. It was planned. Carefully. Patiently. Built over years. And then came the records. Or what was left of them. In a locked chest hidden beneath a staircase, investigators found scraps of paper. Most were damaged. Some were burned. Others barely legible. But a few contained just enough information to raise even more questions. Names. Dates. Numbers. Short notes written in hurried, uneven handwriting. Arrived. Moved. Delivered. No explanations. No details. Just fragments of something far more organized than anyone had imagined. By now, the entire region was on edge. Families began coming forward, desperate for answers. Mothers carrying old letters. Fathers holding on to fading descriptions. Each one hoping, praying, that their missing loved ones might finally be found. But with every new discovery, hope became harder to hold on to. One woman, her voice shaking, told investigators about her younger brother. He had left months earlier after accepting work from a man passing through their town. It sounded like a good opportunity. Better pay. A fresh start. He never made it back. Another man spoke about a group of travelers who had stayed at Harrow's Rest during a long journey south. He had shared a meal with them. Laughed with them. Watched them walk into the inn as the sun went down. The next morning, they were gone. Along with their wagon. Their belongings. Everything. At the time, no one questioned it. Now, those memories felt like pieces of something much darker. But the most important breakthrough came from someone no one expected. A boy. He was found just outside the region, weak, exhausted, and clearly terrified. At first, he refused to speak. Wouldn't answer questions. Wouldn't even look anyone in the eye. But slowly, carefully, he began to talk. His name was Isaac Turner. And what he revealed would change everything. Isaac had spent years inside Harrow's world. Not as a visitor. Not as a guest. But as someone trapped within it. He described hidden rooms exactly where investigators had found them. He spoke of people being brought in during the night. Blindfolded. Restrained. Confused. He described the fear. The silence. The way voices would echo through the walls, then suddenly stop. And then he said something that made the entire room go still. There were more, he whispered. Not just her. According to Isaac, Eleanor Harrow didn't operate alone. There were others. Men who came and went. Some stayed for days. Some for weeks. All connected in ways he didn't fully understand. They had roles. Specific ones. Some found people. Some transported them. Others handled what happened inside the inn. It was a system. A network. And it stretched far beyond Briar Crossroads. Isaac described wagons leaving late at night. Always heading south. Always heavily guarded. He didn't know where they were going. Only that the people inside those wagons never came back. As he spoke, investigators realized something chilling. The graves they had found might only represent a fraction of the truth. Because if Isaac was right, then this wasn't just about what happened here. It was about everything that happened after. And that meant one thing. Somewhere out there, there were still answers waiting to be uncovered. But finding them would mean going deeper. Far deeper than anyone had planned. Because the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. And the more they started to realize. This story wasn't over. Not even close. Isaac's words didn't just disturb the investigators, they changed the entire direction of the case. Up until that moment, everything pointed to one place. One property. One woman. But now, that idea was falling apart. Because if what Isaac was saying was true, then what they had uncovered at Harrow's Rest wasn't the center of the operation. It was just one piece of it. And that meant something far more dangerous. It meant there were others out there who hadn't been caught. Others who knew the system. Others who might already be disappearing. The room where Isaac gave his statement remained silent long after he finished speaking. No one rushed to respond. No one interrupted. Because deep down, every man in that room was thinking the same thing. If this network was real, then they were already behind. They began asking him more questions carefully, slowly, trying not to push too hard, because it was clear Isaac wasn't just remembering things, he was reliving them. "Do you remember their faces?" one investigator asked. Isaac hesitated, then nodded. He described a man with a scar running along his jaw. Another who always wore gloves, even in the heat. A third who rarely spoke but watched everything. None of the descriptions came with names, just fragments, shadows of people who had passed through the inn like ghosts. But one detail stood out more than anything else. They didn't act like criminals, Isaac said quietly. They acted like it was normal. That sentence lingered because it suggested something far more disturbing than violence. It suggested routine. Whatever this operation was, it wasn't chaotic or reckless. It was controlled. And that meant it had been running long enough for people to get comfortable. Investigators expanded their search immediately. No longer focused on just the property, they began tracing every possible connection. Nearby farms, abandoned buildings, old roads that hadn't been used in years. That's when they started noticing something strange. Patterns. Certain paths showed signs of repeated use, even though they led nowhere important. Wheel tracks that appeared too consistent to be random. Footprints in areas that should have been undisturbed. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. These weren't just paths. They were routes. Routes that connected places no one had thought to connect before. One of those paths led deep into the woods, far beyond the edge of Briar Crossroads. The kind of place most people avoided, even during the day. Dense trees, uneven ground, and a silence that felt unnatural. A small team was sent to investigate. They moved carefully, following the trail as it twisted through the forest. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of what they might find. It took hours before they saw it. A structure barely visible through the trees. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Collapsed roof, broken walls, overgrown with vines and brush. But as they got closer, something didn't feel right. The door wasn't rotted like the rest of the building. It had been used recently. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, heavy. And just like the inn, there were signs. Rope, old but not untouched. Scratches along the walls. Marks on the floor that suggested movement. But this place felt different. Smaller. More temporary. Like it wasn't meant for holding people long, just long enough. One of the men found something near the back wall. A piece of fabric, torn, dirty, but clearly not part of the building. He held it up in the dim light, and for a moment no one spoke. Because they all knew what it meant. This wasn't just one location. It was part of a chain. A system designed to move people from one place to another without ever drawing attention. Back at Harrow's Rest, Isaac continued to reveal more, piece by piece, memory by memory. He spoke about nights when multiple wagons would arrive, never at the same time, always spaced out. People would be taken below, held, then moved again before sunrise. He didn't know where they went after that. Only that once they left, they were gone. They said it was safer that way, he murmured. The word felt wrong, twisted. Safer for who? As investigators compared Isaac's testimony with what they were finding in the field, a clearer picture began to form. This wasn't just about control. It was about efficiency. Everything was designed to minimize risk, to avoid detection, to keep the operation running smoothly. And the more they uncovered, the more one question kept coming back. How long had this really been going on? Because this level of organization didn't happen overnight. Days turned into a week, then longer. Searches expanded. Reports increased. And then something unexpected happened. Someone tried to run. A man was spotted leaving the outskirts of the region late at night, moving fast, avoiding main roads. When authorities caught up to him, he didn't resist, but he didn't speak either. Not at first. It wasn't until he was brought back and questioned alongside Isaac that things began to change. The moment Isaac saw him, everything shifted. His posture, his expression, the fear in his eyes. "You know him," one investigator said. Isaac didn't answer immediately. But then slowly, he nodded. And in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that made the entire room go cold. He was there. The man's silence broke soon after, not out of willingness, but out of realization. Because whatever this operation had been, it was no longer hidden. And the people involved were starting to understand something terrifying. The truth was catching up. And there was nowhere left to hide. But even as the pieces began falling into place, even as names started to surface, one thing became painfully clear. They were still missing something important. Because at the center of it all, the one person who could explain everything, Eleanor Harrow, had yet to speak. And time was running out. By the time the man finally spoke, the atmosphere inside the room had completely changed. It wasn't just an investigation anymore. It felt like something was closing in. He sat across from them, hands bound, eyes shifting between the faces around him. For a long time, he said nothing. Just silence, broken only by the faint crackle of a nearby lantern. Then Isaac spoke first. "You remember me," he said quietly. The man froze. It was subtle, but everyone saw it. The slight tightening of his jaw. The hesitation in his breathing. That was all it took. They leaned in. And slowly, the truth began to surface. At first, it came in fragments. Half answers. Deflections. The kind of responses meant to give just enough without revealing everything. But the pressure built quickly. Because now they had more than suspicion. They had witnesses. Evidence. Patterns that couldn't be denied. And the man knew it. They told us not to stay too long, he muttered eventually, his voice dry. Never in one place. Who told you? An investigator asked. He hesitated. Then looked down. She did. No one needed to ask who he meant. Eleanor Harrow. The name carried weight now. Not just fear, but proof. The man continued, his words uneven, like he was trying to outrun his own thoughts. It wasn't just here, he said. There were others, places like this. Stops along the way. How many? Someone asked. I don't know, he replied quickly. I never saw them all. Just the ones I was sent to. Sent. The word echoed in the room. This wasn't random movement. It was organized direction. Orders. A structure. They pushed further. What happened to the people? Another voice asked. The man swallowed hard. They were moved, he said. Always moved. Where? He shook his head. I didn't ask. But the way he avoided eye contact said enough. He knew. Or at least, he knew more than he was willing to say. Isaac watched him carefully, his expression tightening with every word. You were there, Isaac said again, more firmly this time. You saw what happened. The man's composure cracked. I didn't have a choice, he snapped suddenly, his voice breaking. None of us did. The room went still. Because that sentence didn't sound like denial. It sounded like justification. And that made it worse. Over the next several hours, more details came out. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But enough to start connecting the pieces. The network stretched farther than anyone had expected. Multiple routes. Multiple locations. People assigned to specific roles, just as Isaac had described. Some identified targets. Others handled transport. Others ensured that nothing traced back to them. And always, at the center of it all. Eleanor Harrow. She kept track of everything, the man admitted at one point. Who came in? Who went out? Where they were sent? Records. That explained the scraps they had found. But it also raised another question. Where were the rest of them? Because what they had discovered so far wasn't enough to account for everything. Not for the number of victims they were now beginning to suspect. As the interrogation continued, a growing sense of urgency filled the room. Time mattered now. Because every moment they spent here was a moment others could be escaping. Or worse. Destroying evidence. That fear became very real the next morning. A messenger arrived, breathless, mud covering his boots. Another location had been found. And it had been abandoned. Recently. When investigators reached it, the signs were obvious. Doors left open. Supplies gone. Tracks leading away in multiple directions. Whoever had been there, had left in a hurry. And they hadn't planned on coming back. Word was spreading. The network was reacting. Back at Harrow's Rest, the focus shifted immediately. If others were fleeing, then there was only one person left who might still hold everything together. Eleanor Harrow. She had been held under heavy watch since her arrest, isolated from everyone else. No contact. No communication. Until now. Because they needed answers. And she was the only one who could give them. When they finally brought her in for questioning, the room felt different. Heavier. Colder. She didn't look afraid. That was the first thing everyone noticed. No panic. No desperation. Just a calm, steady gaze as she took her seat. As if she had been expecting this. As if she had already accepted whatever was coming. "You know why you're here," one of the investigators said. She didn't respond. Just watched. "We've uncovered the sites. We've spoken to witnesses. We know what's been happening." Still nothing. Not even a flicker of emotion. It was unsettling. Because most people, when faced with that kind of pressure, break in some way. But not her. "People are dead," another voice said, sharper this time. "Buried on your land." A pause. Then finally, she spoke. "People die everywhere," she said quietly. The words landed like a weight in the room. No denial. No shock. Just indifference. They pressed harder. Names. Locations. Details. Anything that could help them stop what was still out there. But every question met the same response. Calm. Controlled. Empty. At one point, an investigator leaned forward, frustration breaking through. "How long?" he demanded. "How long has this been going on?" For the first time, something changed. Not much. Just a slight shift in her expression. A pause that lasted a second too long. Then she answered. "Long enough," she said. That was it. No elaboration. No explanation. But somehow, it said everything. Because long enough didn't mean months. It didn't even mean a few years. It meant this had been built. Expanded. Perfected. Over time. And no one had stopped it. The realization hit harder than any confession. This hadn't been hidden because it was impossible to find. It had been hidden because no one had looked closely enough. Or maybe no one had wanted to. As the interrogation ended, one truth became impossible to ignore. Even with everything they had uncovered, they were still only seeing part of the picture. Because Eleanor Harrow wasn't talking. And without her, there were still gaps. Still missing pieces. Still people out there who might never be found. That night, as guards took her back to her cell, one of them later said something felt off. Not in an obvious way. Just a feeling. Like something was about to happen. Something they weren't prepared for. He couldn't explain it. But he couldn't shake it either. And by morning, they would understand why. Morning came quietly. Too quietly. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, like the world itself is holding something back. At the holding facility, the guards began their routine as usual. Doors checked. Locks inspected. Cells accounted for. Nothing seemed out of place. Until they reached her cell. Eleanor Harrow. At first, it looked like she was asleep. Lying still, turned slightly to one side, her face partially hidden in shadow. One of the guards called out to her. No response. He stepped closer. Called again. Still nothing. And then, he saw it. The stillness wasn't rest. It was final. Within minutes, the entire building was in motion. Officials rushed in. Doors were sealed. Orders were given, then repeated louder. But it didn't change the reality sitting in that small, dimly lit cell. Eleanor Harrow was dead. The official conclusion came quickly. Self-inflicted. Poison. How she obtained it, no one could say for certain. Some believed it had been hidden long before her arrest. Others suspected someone had helped her. But no proof ever surfaced. Only questions. And far too many of them. The reaction was immediate. Shock. Frustration. Anger. Because with her death, something critical had been lost. The answers. The full truth. The one person who could connect every piece of the network was gone. Investigators tried to move forward anyway. They went back through everything. Every statement. Every location. Every scrap of evidence they had collected. They followed every lead they could find. But without her, the trail began to fade. The remaining suspects were questioned again. Some talked. Some didn't. But none of them had the full picture. Only fragments. Pieces of a system they had been part of, but never truly understood. Over the following weeks, more sites were discovered. Some abandoned. Some barely holding together. All connected in one way or another. But none of them provided what they needed most. Closure. The numbers grew harder to ignore. Dozens of victims confirmed. Possibly more. Maybe far more. Because for every person they found, there were others who had simply disappeared. No trace. No record. No ending. Families kept arriving. Hoping. Asking. Searching for names that might finally appear on a list. But most left the same way they came. With nothing. Isaac Turner remained under protection. His testimony had been critical, and without it, much of what had been uncovered might have stayed buried forever. But even he didn't have all the answers. There were things he never saw. Places he was never taken. People he never met. One evening, as he sat with an investigator reviewing what little remained of the records, he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. "It didn't feel like it had a beginning," he said quietly. The investigator looked at him. "And it didn't feel like it had an end either." That was the part no one wanted to admit. Even with Harrow gone. Even with the main location uncovered. There was no guarantee it was truly over. Because systems like that don't just disappear. They scatter. They adapt. They hide. And if even one part of it survived, then somewhere out there, it could start again. Months passed. Then years. The land around Briar Crossroads slowly returned to silence. The buildings were abandoned. The roads grew quieter. Nature began to reclaim what had been disturbed. But the story didn't fade. Not completely. Travelers passing through the area would sometimes speak of an uneasy feeling. A heaviness in the air. A sense that something had happened there. Something the land hadn't forgotten. Locals avoided certain paths. Not because they were dangerous. But because they remembered. The name Eleanor Harrow became something else over time. Not just a person. But a warning. A reminder of what can exist when no one is watching closely enough. Historians would later examine the case, trying to piece together what had truly happened. They documented the evidence. Compared testimonies. Reconstructed timelines. But even with all of that, there were still gaps. Still missing pieces that no one could fill. And maybe that's what makes this story so unsettling. Not just what was discovered, but what wasn't. Because for every truth that came to light, there were others that remained buried. So now the question isn't just about Eleanor Harrow. It's about everything surrounding her. Was she the mastermind behind it all? Or just one part of something much larger? How many people were truly involved? And how many were never found? And the most chilling question of all. If something like this could exist for so long without being fully uncovered, could it happen again? That's the part that stays with you. Long after the story ends. So what do you think? Was this the end of the network? Or just the end of the part we were able to see? Let me know your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned. Because sometimes, the darkest stories are the ones history almost forgot.